This story is from one of my favorite books, A Book of Witches by Ruth Manning-Sanders, and the story is called Tatterhood. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who had no children. The queen mourned all day, and nothing would make her happy. One day she went out to walk in the forest and came to a little house, and she sat down outside the little house and wept. And a little old woman came out of the house and said, "Why do you weep?" "I weep because I have no children," said the queen. Now this little old woman was a witch, but she was a good and kind one, for such witches do exist in the world, although their number is but few. So this good little witch said to the queen, "I can promise you a child if you will do as I say." "I will do anything," said the queen. "Go home," said the good little witch, "and at bedtime take 2 pails of water and wash in each of them. When you have washed, throw the water from both pails under the bed. Look under the bed next morning, and you will see 2 flowers have sprung up, one fair and one ugly. The fair one you must eat, the ugly one you must not touch. Remember especially not to touch the ugly one, and all may go well with you." The good little witch went back into her house, and the queen went home. That night she had 2 pails of water brought into her bedroom, and she washed herself in both of them. When she had washed, she emptied the water from both the pails under the bed and lay down and slept in hope. And in the morning, when she looked under the bed, lo, there were 2 flowers. One flower was ugly, with black petals and a pinched and starved look about it. The other flower was silvery white and softly shining, most beautiful like a risen star. The queen took up the beautiful flower and ate it. Its perfumed flavor was very sweet, so sweet that the queen longed for more, and before she thought about what she was doing, she had eaten the ugly flower as well, and it had no taste at all about it. Well, sure enough, in a few months after that, the queen gave birth to a baby girl. The baby had a mat of ragged black hair and an ashen gray face. It was very ugly. And as soon as ever that baby was born, it bawled out, "Mama!" "If I'm your mama," said the queen, "God give me the grace to mend my ways." "Oh, never worry yourself about me," said the hideous little baby. "The one who comes after me will be much better looking." Somehow or other, this hideous little baby got hold of a wooden spoon and a goat, and before she was a week old, she was riding about on that goat and banging with the wooden spoon. The queen couldn't bear the sight of her and was as unhappy as she had been before, until she had another baby girl. The second baby was as beautiful as a new risen star. Her eyes were as darkly blue as the night sky, and her hair shone like silver. The queen called this second baby Berenice, which is the name of a star, and she loved her beyond all telling. But the elder sister they called Tatterhood, because she would go about in a ragged hood to cover up her lank locks of black hair. The queen did not love Tatterhood any better as the years passed, and the royal nurses tried to shut her up in a room by herself, but it was no good. Wherever Berenice went, there Tatterhood would be also. And though the queen could not understand it, Berenice loved her ugly sister dearly. Well, one Christmas Eve, when the sisters were nearly grown up, Tatterhood was riding about the palace on her goat and banging away with her wooden spoon, pretending, no doubt, that she was a knight in armor, when she heard a screaming and a clattering in the gallery outside the queen's bedroom. She galloped off to the queen and said, "What is all the racket going on up there?" "Whatever it is," said the queen, "it has nothing to do with you. Go away and keep quiet if you can." But Tatterhood wouldn't go away and keep quiet. She said that whatever it was, she was going to go up there and fight it. So when the queen told her that it was a pack of witches who had come down there to keep Christmas, "They come and go," she said. "We can do nothing about it." "Oh, can't we?" said Tatterhood. "Go away," said the queen. "Yes, I am going," said Tatterhood. "I am going up to the gallery to drive the witches out. But you must keep all the doors that lead into the gallery shut and locked while I am about it." "Go away," said the queen again. Tatterhood went away. She went up to the gallery, and the gallery was swarming with witches. They leaped upon Tatterhood in a fury, but she banged about her with her wooden spoon and swept them along like autumn leaves before her. The whole palace creaked and groaned as if every joint and beam was being torn out of its place, but the witches fled before Tatterhood's wooden spoon. Of the whole pack of them, there was but one witch left when one of the doors of the gallery opened softly, for the silly queen had not heeded what Tatterhood had said about locking them, and Berenice peeped in. "What is happening?" began Berenice. But that last witch had seen the shining head, and before Tatterhood could stop her, that witch had snatched the shining head from Berenice's shoulders and put a calf's head in its place. Now poor little Berenice could say nothing but moo. The queen was in hysterics. The king was raving, but Tatterhood rounded on them with fierce words for not locking the gallery doors, and they fell silent. "Give me a ship in full trim," said Tatterhood. "I will set my sister free if I can. I want no captain, I want no sailors. My sister and I must set out on this voyage alone." There was no denying her that ship she must have, and she got it. Tatterhood took her goat and her wooden spoon and went aboard. Her poor little calf-headed sister followed. Away they sailed, and Tatterhood steered her ship to the land where the witches lived. When she came to the landing place, she told Berenice to stay on board, but she herself got astride her goat, took her wooden spoon, and rode up to the witch's castle. When she got there, one of the windows was open, and she saw Berenice's lovely head hung up on the window frame. In through the window she leaped on her goat, snatched the head, and leaped out again. Now the witches were after her, thick as a swarm of angry, buzzing hornets, but she banged about her with her wooden spoon, and the goat leaped and snorted and butted with its horns, and so fierce were they, the pair of them, that the witches fled back. Tatterhood reached the ship, took the calf's head off her sister, put Berenice's own lovely head back in its place again, and flung the calf's head after the retreating witches. "Now, my lovely one," she said to Berenice, "I am going to take you on a long, long voyage." "I will go anywhere you like, dear sister," said Berenice. "Now, my lovely one," Tatterhood said to Berenice, "I am going to take you on a long, long voyage." "I will go anywhere you like, dear sister," said Berenice. They sailed on and on and on. They sailed for a year, and for 2 years, and for 3 years. In the 3rd year, they came to the shores of a new country, and Tatterhood drove her ship into harbor. Now, the palace of the king of the country was near the harbor, and this king was a widower with an only son. The king looked out of a window and saw the strange ship, and he sent messengers to the harbor to find out where the ship came from and who owned it. But when the king's men came to the ship, they saw not a soul on board but Tatterhood. There she was, waving her wooden spoon and riding her goat round and round the deck at top speed. Her hood had fallen from her head, her lank black hair was streaming out behind her, and her queer, ugly face was all a grin like a goblin's. It was the strangest sight the men had ever seen. "Hello," they shouted. "Is there no one but you aboard? Where is the captain? Where are the sailors?" Before you, cried Tatterhood as she galloped around. "Is there no one else but you aboard?" they shouted. "There is also my sister." "Then let us see your sister," shouted the king's men. "No one shall see her unless the king comes himself," cried Tatterhood, and she galloped her goat until the deck thundered. The men went back to the palace and told the king of the strange sight they had seen. The king was foreseeing this strange sight himself, and he hurried down to the harbor. As soon as she saw him, Tatterhood called to him to come aboard. As soon as he had come aboard, she got off her goat and went down to the cabin to fetch Berenice. Never in his life had the king imagined that a maiden could be so beautiful. He fell in love with Berenice on the spot. He took both the sisters back to the palace with him and made much of them. Now nothing would satisfy him that he must have Berenice for his wife. But Tatterhood said, "Certainly not. You shall not have my sister unless your son will have me." The king sent for the prince. Oh, dear. The prince gave one look at Tatterhood and covered his eyes. "No, no, I will not have her. Nothing shall induce me to marry that fright." "As you please," said Tatterhood, and she took Berenice back to the ship. "In a week we set sail, and you will never see us again," she said to the king. The king was in despair. He threatened to disinherit his son. The prince sulked, the king raged, the whole court was in a turmoil. The days passed, the week was nearly up, and there was Tatterhood galloping her goat round and round the deck of the ship, but there was no sign of Berenice. The king went down to the harbor. "Let me but look upon her once again," he cried to Tatterhood. But Tatterhood shouted, "You know my terms," and went back to madly galloping her goat. The king went back to the palace and said to the prince, "If you do not yield by tomorrow, I will cut off your head." The prince stuck out his jaw and said, "I will not marry that fright." The king's counselors came to the prince, the courtiers came to the prince, the lords in waiting and the ladies in waiting came to the prince. They knelt before him, they entreated him. "Do not throw your precious life away," they implored him. "Marry her, and when she is your wife, you can shut her up in a palace by herself." "Very well," said the prince at last, "I will marry her, and when she is my wife, I will shut her up in a dungeon, for what can she be but a witch?" Now the king was all smiles. He would have embraced his obedient son, but the prince pushed him away. The king didn't heed. He hurried to the harbor and bade Tatterhood bring Berenice to the palace. He hastened to the preparation for the wedding. There was such a baking and a brewing and such a running about of tailors and dressmakers, such a dressing up of lords and ladies, such a preening before mirrors, such a trying on of jewels and coronets, such an arriving of musicians and singers, such a gilding of chariots and grooming of horses as the realm had never seen before. But the prince would have no new clothes. As for Tatterhood, there she was, preparing to go to church, riding on her goat and waving her wooden spoon. And that's the way Tatterhood did go to church. First the king drove off with his bride in a golden coach drawn by 10 prancing white horses. And the bride was so lovely that The people crowded the streets to see her pass and gazed after her until she was out of sight. And then came the coaches with the counselors and the lords and the ladies, a very grand procession. And last of all came the prince on horseback with his head down, and beside him rode Tatterhood on her goat, waving her wooden spoon. "Why don't you say something?" said Tatterhood to the prince. And the prince answered gloomily, "What is there for me to say?" "Well, you might at least ask me why I ride upon this ugly goat," said Tatterhood. "Why do you ride upon that ugly goat?" said the prince. "Oh, is it an ugly goat?" said Tatterhood. "Oh, no, it is the grandest horse that ever a bride rode on." And lo, the goat became a horse, and that horse was the most magnificent animal that ever trod the earth. "I knew she was a witch," thought the doleful prince, but he said no word, and they rode on in silence until Tatterhood said again, "Why don't you say something?" And again the prince answered gloomily, "What is there for me to say?" "Well, you might at least ask me why I ride with this ugly spoon in my fist." "All right, why do you ride with that ugly spoon in your fist?" said the doleful prince. "Is it an ugly spoon? Why, it's the loveliest silver wand that ever a bride carried," said Tatterhood. And lo, the wooden spoon became a silver wand, shining so brightly in the sunlight that the prince's eyes were dazzled. But he said no word, and they rode on in silence until Tatterhood said again, "Why don't you say something?" And the doleful prince answered, "What is there for me to say?" "You might at least ask me why I wear this ragged hood on my head." "Well, then, why do you wear that ragged hood?" "Is it a ragged hood?" she said. "Why, it's the brightest golden crown that ever a bride wore." And lo, on the instant, the tattered hood became a golden crown. They rode on in silence until Tatterhood said, "Why don't you say something?" "I have nothing to say," answered the doleful prince. "You might at least ask me why my face is so ugly and ashen gray." "All right," the prince said peevishly. "Why is your face so ugly and ashen gray?" "Am I ugly?" said Tatterhood. "Why, you think my sister is beautiful, but I am more beautiful than she is." And lo, when the prince looked at her, there she was, a maiden more lovely than all the stars in heaven. "Oh, my beautiful one," gasped the prince, "who and what are you?" "As you see me, so I am," said Tatterhood, and she laughed. You may be sure the prince didn't hang his head or wish to tarry after that. The pair of them rode on at a brisk pace and soon caught up with the bridal procession. Now the people who crowded the streets were not looking at Berenice any longer. They had eyes for no one but the beautiful Tatterhood. They cheered and cheered as she and the prince rode by. So they all arrived at the church and were married, and the king and Berenice, and the prince and Tatterhood. And Berenice said, "Now you see my sister as she really is. She was always beautiful to me." They rejoiced together, they held the bridal feast, and all went merrily. Thanks for listening.